In this class we're going to talk about absorption costing. The aim of absorption costing is to calculate the total cost of each unit by incorporating an appropriate share of the company's overheads. So absorption costing is about allocating the overheads. This is done by identifying cost centers. These may be departments of the company with a departmental head responsible for the performance of the cost center. So there may be a cost center and the overheads have to be allocated across that. So allocate the cost to the cost centers. Clearly, if an invoice is for something which is used exclusively by one cost center, then that cost center will pay for it. But if it's an invoice for something that cuts across the whole organization and different cost centers, then that invoice must be broken up according to what proportion of the expenditure is used in each cost center. So each one should pay its fair share. So apportion the remaining costs on a fair and meaningful basis. For example, you could use floor area to allocate the rent. So the whole organization has to pay rent for the premises. How much should the production department pay for rent? Well, look at the floor area used by the production people and express the whole area, express that area, the area for production, as a percentage of the whole area and apply it to the invoice, apply it to the bill. Or you could look at the number of employees for a canteen cost. So there, you have to look for some meaningful basis, some reasonable basis for allocating to the different cost centers. Finally, reapportion service cost centers, this is called secondary apportionment, over production cost centers. So reapportion the service centers. So the service centers service the whole organization. Reapportion that, again on some meaningful basis, to all of the production centers, so that the cost of the product being produced within that production center is accurately reflecting the overheads as well as the immediate costs, the cost of the raw materials, the labor, the energy it uses, as well as all of that. It bears a burden for the canteen cost, or for the rent, or for the maintenance of the whole building. So it needs to be allocated. Now cost centers. Well, costs may be grouped together in cost centers. These cost centers are often the functional departments of the company. So a cost center could be just a department, or it could be some arrangement between departments to pay for a certain element of production. That becomes the cost center. But generally speaking, cost centers tend to be based on departments. So the department within a business is the cost center, generally speaking. Now an overhead that's wholly related to the cost center may be allocated to it. I said this earlier, but clearly if the production department has a bill, has an invoice that relates to something that's obviously related to production, then the production cost center should pay for that. So overheads wholly related to a cost center are allocated to that cost center. If an overhead relates to more than one cost center, it must be apportioned on some fair and meaningful basis. So If an overhead relates to two or more cost centers, then it must be broken up so that each cost center shoulders the burden accurately and fairly. And therefore the costs of the cost centers, the cost of production, let's say, or the cost of some activity within the cost center, accurately reflects the true cost of production. The choice of basis varies from cost to cost. For example, floor area. Well, the floor area may relate to rates, rent, heating, cleaning, lighting. So an overhead relating to cleaning could be allocated on the basis of floor area. How much floor area does each cost center take up? What is the proportion of the floor area taken up by a cost center as a proportion of the total area of the building? And that proportion then should be applied to the overhead. So floor area tends to go with rates, rent, heating, cleaning, lighting. The number of employees, well, the canteen, health and safety, personnel. Clearly those are related to the number of employees. So different cost centers will have different numbers of people working for them. Take the total number implied, take the number implied again, let's say in one cost center, say production again. That number divided by the total number of employees gives you a proportion. Apply that proportion to the overhead and it gives you some apportionment. It gives you some way of allocating the overhead according to the number of employees. We'll see how this works in a little table later on. The value of plant and machinery, well, the value of the plant and machinery could relate to depreciation and insurance. Those would be overheads that could be allocated in that way. Let's have a look at a little table. In fact, this table appeared in a different video in these classes, but I've just taken one out because I don't want to confuse the issue by looking at all of that again. So I've just taken one out, and we'll say here is a business, and it has rent, business rates, insurance on building, and so on. Now, the number of employees. Well, let's say the number of employees is the basis for the apportionment. As I said, it could be rent, rates. Sorry, it could be any of the ones we talked about a moment ago. Now, let's say we do it on the basis of employees, and we're going to allocate lighting and heating. So we know that I'll put the cursor onto the screen. We know that the total overhead here is 400. And we know that there are 1,420 employees. So for the finishing department has got 200 employees. The stores has got 20. Assembly's got 800, and so on. So the finishing department has got 200. So 200 divided by 1,420 is 0.14 down here. Multiply 400 by 0.14 and we get 56. So according to this view, 56 pounds out of the 400 pounds should be allocated to the finishing department. That's their burden. They must pay 56 pounds of the total bill. It must appear in their accounts. Now, I do that deliberately because really lighting and heating may not be appropriate to allocate them on the basis of employees. It might be better to do it on floor area. In other words, the basis for the apportionment here, the number of employees, may not be correct. So care needs to be taken when deciding the basis of the apportionment. perhaps floor area would have been a better bet for allocating lighting and heating. Perhaps. So I'm just throwing that in as a criticism of the table. In other words, whenever you get a table like this, don't just accept it, just look at the top here and say, well, was that the proper basis for the apportionment? Now I can see arguments here that says that it is, could be, number of employees, that's related to lighting and heating. The more employees, the more lighting, the more heating, or whatever, could be. But more than likely I think it's going to be done on floor area. So that's, as I said earlier, it's dealt with in a separate video, so please look at that as well. Now let's go back and talk about absorption costing. The objective of overhead absorption process is to include in the total cost of a product an appropriate share of a company's total overheads, according to Tom Lucy. Overhead costs are indirect costs, fixed, which do not change despite the level of activity. So overhead costs are fixed costs. They have to be met irrespective of the level of output. They do not vary with the level of output. Absorption costing is used to absorb overhead costs into product unit costs. This is done by using an overhead absorption rate. Overhead absorption rate, OAR. To calculate the overhead absorption by a product, it is necessary to establish the OAR, the overhead absorption rate. This is done by dividing the total overhead attributed to a given cost center by the productive capacity used in making the product. In other words, the OAR is equal to the budgeted overhead divided by the budgeted activity level. Now, that gives us some understanding of the rate at which the overhead is absorbed. The productive capacity is normally measured in machine hours or labour hours, which depends on that particular activity in the cost centre. So, the OAR is calculated in advance of the counting period, which means the OARs are budgeted figures. So the overhead absorption rate figures are budgeted. They're calculated before production takes place. Actual overheads and actual production are not known until the end of the period, and then the amount of over or under absorption may be calculated. It's like a lot in budgeting. You don't know the outcome until the very end to see if there was an overspend or an underspend. Likewise, if the absorption rate was too much or too little. Absorption costing. Well, a company must calculate its selling prices for its products that allows it to recover its total overheads. In order to do this, an absorption cost of the product must be applied. In other words, we have direct labour, clearly that's used to make the product, direct materials made from raw materials and semi-finished goods, direct expenses, whatever the direct expenses are, depends on the nature of the product, plus the overheads of the business, the rent, the rates, the utilities, all of the overheads, and those are apportioned so that the absorption cost of the product is then worked out. In other words, the selling price is based on a cost, a unit cost, which reflects not just the direct inputs, the direct costs, but also the overheads. Under an over-absorption of overheads, well, I mentioned this earlier. Predetermined overhead absorption rates. Well, overhead absorption rates are predetermined, i.e. they are calculated in advance of the period in which they will be used, so that managers have an overhead rate permanently available, which they can use in production costing, price quotations, and so on. So absorption rates are calculated in advance. They're allocated in advance. So they're really just budgeted figures. And they're used by managers to calculate the production costs, and hence they're used for pricing purposes. But they are budgeted, so there may be too much or too little. In other words, the production costs may be overcalculated or undercalculated, and hence the price may be overstated or understated. The actual overhead costs and activity levels are not known until the end of the period. At the end of the period, it's possible to reconcile the budget with the actual. It would not be desirable for managers to have to wait until the end of the period before they had a rate of overhead that they could use on a day-to-day basis. So for that reason, generally speaking, this allocation of overheads is done before the end of the accounting period. So managers have some guidelines as to what the costs are. It's not done at the they don't have to work until the end, I should say, to get the figure, because they need the figure as they work over that period. The problem with using predetermined overhead absorption rate is that the actual figures for overheads and the absorption base are likely to be different from the estimates used in calculating the absorption rates. It is this difference which causes an under and over absorption of the production overhead. So the actual figures for overheads and for the absorption base are likely to be different from the estimates used in calculating the absorption rate. The reason is quite simple. The figure used is not necessarily the actual figure. The actual figure is not known until the end. So they are working with a best guess in the meantime. Under-absorption takes place when the total amount of the overhead recovered is less than the actual overheads incurred in the period. That's fairly straightforward. If the amount recovered is less than the actual overheads incurred in the period, there's under-absorption. The full overheads were not absorbed. Over-absorption happens when the total overheads that are absorbed is more than the actual level of overheads. Sometimes the allocated figure that managers have to work with was too much. It was overcalculated. And so some adjustment has to take place at the end of the period. Over and under absorption of overheads. Well, there are many reasons why under and over absorption occurs. And here's a list of just 5. There could be errors in calculating the overheads. Well, that's possible. So the overheads are not properly calculated in the first place. If the method of production changes, this will have an immediate effect on the overhead. If it's a production system and the method of production is changed halfway through the accounting period, then the overhead will be affected. There could be a decrease in overhead due to environmental factors. Perhaps the company is becoming more environmentally friendly, or there could be a change in overheads due to outside influences, not necessarily related to the physical environment outside. It could be that the government changes the tax rate on something, reduces the tax rate, so that the overhead should be changed in the middle of the accounting period. The valuation of work in progress, WIP, may occur in the wrong process. So work in progress, the valuation of the work in progress may complicate the final article. For example, if costs were allocated to work in progress, if overheads were allocated to work in progress, and that allocation was not correct, and then the work in progress was allocated to the final product, then they are carrying in errors in the calculation. So it depends really on the scale of the business whether this is a big issue or not. If it's a small business, it may not be that much of a problem. It could be corrected very easily, perhaps. There could be unexpected changes in production output. If all the costs were worked out on the basis of a certain flow of production, the flow of production was to change, then unit costs may change accordingly, and the allocation of the overhead may be affected. So there are many issues, but to be perfectly blunt, it really depends on the nature of the product and the nature of the business, and many of these may not be that important in some businesses. There are some recent developments in absorption costing. Historically, the most common method of absorbing production overheads has been based on direct labour hours. This is because production tended to be labour intensive in the past, and the mechanisms existed to record the labour hours attributable to particular unit costs. So in the past, labour hours were a benchmark. There was an underlying assumption that all labour hours were the same and that people worked equally hard throughout the organisation, and there were issues about different people doing different jobs, and it was all glossed over. But historically, that was one of the bases for allocating. There are recent developments in absorption cost methods. Modern production methods tend to be more mechanized. There are more machines and perhaps less people involved in the production process. And this has had two effects. The nature of production overhead is changing. Costs such as power, machine maintenance and depreciation are becoming larger and more prevalent, because those are really the inputs. Those are replacing labour. And also the number of labour hours is reducing. This leads to very high figures for hourly absorption rates based on direct labour, because there is less labour, so it means that the divisor is much smaller, leading to a bigger allocation. So with the change in modern production towards mechanization, changes have to be made in the way absorption costing is done. I think what we need from this class is a greater understanding of how absorption is done and the basis upon which it's done, and what are the upsides and the downsides of absorption costing. The last point on the mechanism, well, to use machine hours as an absorption base can help to overcome this problem, the problem of it being too big because there are fewer workers if we were using labour hours as the basis. since machine hours are more likely to reflect the incidence of machine-based overheads. However, modern management accounting systems which use absorption costing have gone further than this, and a technique called activity-based costing has been developed. We're not going to look at it, but absorption costing is changing. That's the point. So what we need, as I said earlier, what we need is the basis for the allocation and how the overhead is split between the cost centres. What are the cost centres and how are they relevant in the whole pricing and costing schema? And what is absorption costing and what are its up and downsides? And these more modern debates about the problems of over and under, useful, but I think in many businesses they can compensate for this. Particularly smaller business, they can compensate, they can adjust quite quickly to changes once they know about them. So that concludes this session on absorption costing. So thank you for watching.